The dining table stretched long beneath the dim light of a flickering lantern, its silence as sharp as a blade. The widow sat with weary eyes, her son across from her, and the stepfather at the head of the table with the authority he believed was his by right. Yet beneath the surface of their meal, tension brewed like a storm rolling over the plains. The boy had endured years of scorn, years of being told he was less, that he would never measure up. But on this night, his defiance broke through, and the truth, long buried like bones beneath the desert earth, began to surface. The stepfather's voice carried the weight of command, his words sharp, dripping with the arrogance of a man convinced of his dominance. He spoke as though the boy owed him his life, as though the widow's son should bow to the authority of a father who was not his blood. But the boy's eyes burned with a fire inherited from somewhere else, a lineage untold, a strength unacknowledged. His silence shattered, and with it, the fragile balance of the home. The widow's hands trembled as she tried to calm the storm, but her son's voice rose above the table, steady and fierce. He was no longer the child they thought they could mold, no longer the shadow in the house of another man. His defiance struck deep, not just against the stepfather's cruelty, but against the lies that had defined his very identity. The truth he demanded could no longer be kept hidden, not from him, not from the valley, not from anyone. The stepfather's jaw clenched, his pride wounded by the boy's rebellion. He lashed back with threats, with accusations, with the venom of a man desperate to maintain control. But the son did not yield. His words, bold and unshaken, forced open a door the widow had long prayed would remain closed. And in that moment, the weight of secrets too heavy to be carried alone pressed against her heart. Then, like a sudden crack of thunder across the dry plains, it came. The revelation spilled into the open, raw and undeniable. The boy's blood was not what they believed, his lineage bound not to the man who sat at the head of the table, but to a truth far greater, more dangerous, and more powerful than any of them had imagined. The dinner had become more than a family quarrel. It was the beginning of a reckoning that would change everything. The words hung in the air like smoke from a gunshot, impossible to call back. The widow lowered her gaze, her fingers tightening around the edge of the table, as if it were the only thing keeping her steady. Her son stared at her, his chest rising and falling with the fury of someone who had waited too long for an answer. The stepfather's knife clattered against his plate as he slammed it down, his face twisting with the kind of rage that belonged more to a man cornered than a man in control. The boy had defied him before, but this time was different. This time, the truth threatened to tear away the very ground beneath his feet. The son's voice, steady though his hands trembled, demanded to know who he truly was. For years he had carried the burden of silence, the whispers in town, the cruel remarks of those who hinted at secrets he did not understand. Now, seated at that table, he refused to swallow them any longer. He would no longer live as an outcast in his own home, no longer bow to a man who had never seen him as anything but a thorn. His eyes blazed with the same fire that had driven cowhands to stand against tyranny, the same fire that had carved justice into the dust of the West. The stepfather leaned forward, his hand pressing against the table, his voice cutting through the room like a whip. He reminded the boy of every meal he had eaten, every roof he had slept under, every day he had lived because of his stepfather's hand. He spat the words with venom, insisting that gratitude should silence defiance. But the boy did not flinch. Gratitude built on cruelty, he said, was nothing more than chains disguised as mercy. The room fell deathly silent, the lantern flickering, as if the walls themselves recoiled at his boldness. The widow finally spoke, her voice breaking like a brittle twig beneath the weight of years unspoken. She pleaded for peace, her words trembling with the desperation of a woman caught between two fires. She had hoped the truth could remain hidden, that her son could be spared from the burden of bloodlines and grudges. But now, under the unrelenting gaze of her child, she saw there was no more room for silence. Her secrets had become his prison, and it was time to set him free, even if the truth destroyed everything she had built. The stepfather's eyes narrowed, sensing his power slipping through his fingers. For years he had ruled the boy through dominance and scorn, comforted by the belief that the boy carried no heritage worth claiming. If that illusion crumbled, so too would the foundation of his authority. His hand drifted near the pistol at his hip, not to draw it, but as if the cold steel could remind him of the control he still thought he had. But deep inside, he knew control was no longer his to keep. The boy's chair scraped back against the floor as he rose, his figure tall and unyielding against the dim light of the room. He had inherited no riches, no land, but in that moment he carried something greater, the weight of conviction. His voice grew steadier as he spoke, demanding answers, daring the silence to break. The widow's eyes filled with tears, torn between the fear of what the truth would unleash and the relief of finally letting it breathe. The stepfather barked a laugh, sharp and bitter, mocking the boy's hunger for answers. He claimed bloodlines were nothing more than stories, illusions that gave weak men something to cling to. But his words rang hollow, stripped of the authority they once carried. He saw the boy's defiance for what it truly was, the awakening of a spirit that would no longer bow. And deep down, he feared what would happen when the truth was finally spoken. The widow stood then, her hands trembling as she placed them flat against the table. Her voice quivered, but it did not falter. She confessed that her son's blood did not belong to the man who had raised him, nor to the name he had carried in silence. His true father had been a man of the frontier, a rider whose courage was known across the valley, whose death had left behind more than just legend. It had left a son. The boy's eyes widened, the air leaving his lungs as if he had been struck. The stepfather's face darkened, his pride crumbling as the truth stripped him of the control he had lorded over the boy for years. He snarled, reminding the widow of the promise she had made, the vow to bury the truth so deep that no one would ever know. But vows made from fear cannot stand against the fire of truth. The boy's gaze turned from shock to fury, not at his mother, but at the man who had built his cruelty on lies. The revelation spread through the room like wildfire. The boy, once mocked as lesser, now bore the blood of a man revered, a man who had carved his name into the story of the West. The stepfather's authority cracked beneath the weight of that truth, for the boy no longer stood as his subject. He stood as his equal, perhaps even his better. And as the silence stretched between them, one thing became certain. The dinner table had become a battlefield, and the war was only just beginning. The lantern's flame flickered, shadows dancing across the walls like restless spirits. The widow sat back down, her face pale, her hands trembling as though the very act of revealing the truth had stolen years from her. But her son stood firm, the silence of the room amplifying his voice when he spoke. He declared that he would no longer answer to a man who despised him, no longer bend to the will of a stepfather who had tried to erase his worth. His words carried the weight of generations, echoing with the courage of the father he had never known. The stepfather leaned forward, his voice low, dripping with venom. He sneered that blood alone meant nothing, that names and legends could not feed a family or tame the land. He claimed the boy owed everything he had to him, the roof above his head, the meals in his stomach, the very chance to live. But the boy's stare never wavered. He reminded the stepfather that cruelty disguised as provision was no gift at all, and that the land did not belong to the man who shouted the loudest, but to the one who could stand tallest when truth demanded it. The widow pleaded for calm, her eyes moving from her son to her husband, torn between the family she had built and the past she had buried. She feared that the bloodline revealed would not only destroy their home, but also ignite conflicts far beyond their walls. For the West was unforgiving, and the revelation of a name once thought buried could awaken enemies eager to settle old scores. Yet even in her fear, she knew there was no turning back. Once spoken, the truth lived outside her, beyond her control. The stepfather's pride, sharp as barbed wire, bled under the pressure of exposure. He had built his authority on the boy's supposed weakness, on the belief that he could mold him into something small and obedient. Now, stripped of that illusion, he found himself staring at someone stronger, someone who carried not only defiance, but the spirit of a bloodline larger than his own. It was a power he could not command, a fire he could not extinguish. The boy's voice rose once more, steadier, louder, as he promised that he would carve his own path, not as a shadow of another man, but as the heir to a truth that no stepfather could deny. The widow's tears fell freely, for she saw the boy not as the child she had tried to shield, but as the man he was becoming. The stepfather's face darkened, but behind his rage flickered something more dangerous: fear. For he knew the West respected bloodlines, and the boy's blood was a legacy he could never erase. Word of the confrontation at the dinner table did not remain confined within the widow's home. The ranch hands, who had long sensed the tension within those walls, carried whispers into town. By morning, the story spread through the saloon, the blacksmith shop, and the churchyard. People spoke of the widow's son, no longer the quiet boy mocked for being lesser, but the rightful heir of a man whose legend still echoed in the valley. The revelation shook the foundation of their small world, and with every retelling, the boy's shadow grew taller. The stepfather tried to contain it, tried to dismiss the truth as the delusion of a rebellious child. He barked at the ranch hands, silenced the gossip where he could, and clung to the power he had wielded for so long. Yet every denial only fueled the fire, for the more he tried to crush the story, the more people believed it. And in the West, where reputation traveled faster than a bullet, the truth, or even the perception of it, was stronger than steel. The widow moved through town with lowered eyes, her silence confirming what her words could not. Those who had once pitied her now looked at her with a strange mix of respect and unease. She had carried a secret that had the power to shift loyalties and ignite rivalries. And though she had revealed it in desperation, she could no longer control its reach. The valley now held her truth, and it would not be forgotten. The boy, meanwhile, walked differently. His shoulders straightened, his steps deliberate, his gaze unflinching. He bore no wealth, no land, yet people stepped aside when he passed, as though they sensed something greater beneath his skin. He did not boast, nor did he threaten, but his silence spoke volumes, the silence of a young man who knew who he was at last. The stepfather watched this transformation with growing dread. Every glance, every whisper in town, every ranch hand who hesitated before obeying him was proof that his grip was loosening. The truth had taken root, and no matter how much he fought, he could not uproot it. The dinner table had not just revealed a secret. It had shifted the balance of power. And in the Old West, power once lost was rarely regained. The valley became restless with the weight of what had been revealed. Around the saloons and trading posts, whispers grew louder, whispers about the boy's bloodline, about the name that could no longer be hidden. Some called him the rightful heir of a man who had died too soon, a man whose courage still echoed in the hills. Others warned that such a legacy would invite trouble, that enemies of his father would resurface to finish what time had not. In a land where stories traveled faster than writers, the truth had already become legend. The stepfather felt his grip on the ranch slipping away like sand through clenched fists. His commands no longer carried the same force, for the ranch hands now looked at the boy differently, not as a child beneath them, but as the son of someone whose name carried weight. Respect, once demanded through fear, now shifted naturally toward the boy. Every glance, every whispered word, was a reminder that authority could not be maintained through intimidation when the blood of a legacy spoke louder. The widow moved quietly through her days, burdened by both relief and sorrow. She had wanted to protect her son from this revelation, to spare him the dangers tied to his father's name. Yet now that the truth was free, she realized there was no shielding him anymore. She watched as he grew into the knowledge of who he was, his steps more certain, his gaze sharper, as though the spirit of his father walked beside him. Still, her heart ached, for truth often came with a price, and she feared what that price might be. The boy embraced his newfound identity with both pride and anger. Pride in knowing the blood of a respected man ran through his veins, anger at the years stolen from him by lies and scorn. His defiance toward his stepfather was no longer the rebellion of a boy, but the stance of a man who knew he had something worth defending. And in the West, once a man claimed his place, the world would test him to see if he was strong enough to keep it. The stepfather, humiliated and cornered, grew darker in his thoughts. He had always ruled through dominance, but now dominance was slipping away. And though he wore the mask of control at the dinner table, inside he seethed with the desperation of a man who knew he had been bested not by force, but by truth. His pride demanded vengeance, and vengeance in the Old West was a seed that rarely failed to grow. The following days turned the household into a quiet battlefield. Meals were tense, the air thick with unspoken words and lingering glares. The boy no longer sought the approval of his stepfather, nor did he bend beneath his scorn. Instead, he worked the ranch with a new determination, every swing of the axe, every pull of the rope, a declaration that he belonged to something greater than the man who had tried to claim him. His silence carried strength, and the hand around him began to follow his lead. The widow tried to mend the rift, but her words fell into the widening canyon between her son and her husband. She saw in her son the rising fire of a legacy he was only beginning to understand, and in her husband the crumbling pride of a man desperate to hold onto control. Each day, the line between them grew sharper, until it was no longer a question of if conflict would come, but when. The townsfolk began to choose sides in whispers. Some believed the boy would inherit not only his father's name, but also his enemies, and they feared what storms that would bring. Others saw in him the chance for a new kind of leadership, one forged not from fear, but from truth. In the marketplace, his name was spoken with caution, but also with a respect that had never been his before. The West thrived on legends, and it had only just begun to take root. The stepfather, feeling his authority unravel, resorted to harsher commands. He barked orders at the ranch hands, punished small mistakes with unnecessary cruelty, and tried to remind everyone that he was still master of the house. But the more he pressed, the weaker he appeared. The men followed his orders, but their loyalty shifted in silence, their glances drifting toward the boy whose presence grew stronger with each passing day. By the time another dinner came, the roles had shifted. The stepfather still sat at the head of the table, but the power no longer belonged to him. The widow's son, once scorned and dismissed, now carried himself as though the seat of authority had already shifted to his side. The truth had reshaped the household, the ranch, and the town. And in the Old West, once the truth carved its mark, nothing, not pride, not threats, not even bloodshed, could ever erase it. The valley grew heavy with expectation, as though the land itself anticipated a storm yet to break. The widow's son no longer walked as the boy they had once dismissed. He carried himself with the weight of heritage, with the steady bearing of one who had discovered the truth of his bloodline. At the blacksmith's forge, men lowered their voices when he entered, and in the saloon, gamblers paused their games to glance his way. It was not fear that followed him now, but recognition, the recognition that he was no longer invisible. The stepfather, however, felt the noose of humiliation tighten with each passing day. His authority over the household had been broken the night the truth was spoken, and though he tried to enforce it with harsher words and heavier hands, it slipped further away. Every time a ranch hand obeyed the boy before him, every time the widow's eyes lingered with pride on her son, the stepfather's rage deepened. And rage, in the West, was never far from violence. The widow herself became more fragile under the strain. She had carried her secret for years, convinced that silence was the safest path. Now, with it unleashed, she feared both for her son's safety and for the inevitable clash it would provoke. Yet, as she watched him take on the ranch's burdens with resolve, she also felt a quiet pride. He was no longer a shadow in his own home. He was stepping into the place his true father might have dreamed for him. At night, the boy often sat alone beneath the wide sky, staring at the stars that had once seemed so distant. He wondered about the man whose blood ran in his veins, a rider of courage, a man respected even in death. He felt both the burden and the blessing of that inheritance. The stepfather's voice haunted him, sneering that blood meant nothing, that survival belonged to the strongest. Yet the boy believed strength was not measured by cruelty, but by the will to stand firm when truth demanded it. And so, the tension in the household thickened, each dinner more strained than the last, each day a silent duel of glances and unspoken words. The valley waited, the ranch hands watched, and even the winds seemed to whisper what was coming. For in the Old West, truth never slept, and when it was bound to blood, it always demanded a reckoning. The breaking point arrived one evening as the sun bled red across the horizon, casting long shadows over the land. The family gathered at the table once more, the air thick with anticipation. The stepfather sat stiff and grim, his pride clinging to him like armor. The widow's son, steady and unafraid, met his gaze without wavering. The widow, her heart caught between the two, prayed silently that the night would not end in ruin. The stepfather's words came sharp, accusing, desperate. He claimed the boy's bloodline was nothing more than a story spun by a grieving woman, a tale meant to give meaning where none existed. His voice rose with each denial, but the louder he grew, the weaker his words became. For the truth had already taken root, and everyone at the table, even he, knew it. The boy answered with calm certainty, recounting the whispers he had overheard in town, the men who had spoken of his true father's courage, the resemblance he carried that no denial could erase. He did not shout. He did not need to. His conviction was enough to silence the storm of his stepfather's rage. The widow's tears glistened in the dim light, but she did not interrupt. She had tried to shield her son with silence, but now she saw that his voice was stronger than her fear. The truth, spoken clearly, was no longer a burden but a crown. And though it pained her to watch husband and son at war, she could no longer deny the man her child was becoming. By the time the meal ended, it was clear that the stepfather no longer ruled the household. Though he sat at the head of the table, the power had shifted. It was not his voice that carried weight, but the boy's. The truth of his bloodline had torn through the lies and broken the chains of cruelty. In that silence, heavy and final, the valley knew that a new chapter had begun, one that would test the strength of a legacy born not of fear, but of truth. The ranch itself began to reflect the shift inside the household. The ranch hands, once loyal to the stepfather out of habit and fear, now turned their eyes toward the widow's son. They saw in him not just the fire of youth, but the quiet conviction of a man stepping into his rightful place. Tasks once commanded by the stepfather were carried out, instead, under the boy's watchful gaze. He did not demand obedience. It came naturally, born of respect rather than intimidation. The stepfather, seeing his control slip away, grew restless and bitter. His voice became harsher, his punishments more severe, but these displays only revealed his desperation. The men began to ignore his commands, following the example of the widow's son, who worked beside them instead of above them. Every fence repaired, every herd driven across the plains, became another quiet reminder that the stepfather's authority had eroded. The widow felt the tension with every passing day. Her home, once fragile under the weight of secrets, now balanced on the edge of open conflict. She loved her son, proud of his courage, but she feared the wrath festering in her husband's heart. She knew the West did not forgive humiliation, and men like him would not surrender without a fight. At night, she prayed the land would not be stained with the blood of her family. The boy carried himself with a growing strength, but inside, he wrestled with the enormity of his inheritance. He bore not only the truth of his bloodline, but the responsibility that came with it. Each day he grew more certain that he was meant to lead, to honor the name that had been denied him. Yet he also knew that his stepfather's rage was not finished. A storm was coming, and he would need to be ready when it broke. Whispers spread through town that a reckoning was near. Some said the boy would rise and claim the ranch as his own. Others whispered that the stepfather would strike first to defend his pride. The saloon buzzed with speculation, bets were made quietly, and eyes turned toward the ranch on the horizon. In the Old West, when truth challenged pride, the outcome was rarely peaceful. The final clash came on a night heavy with silence, when the stars above seemed to dim beneath the weight of what was about to unfold. The widow's son worked late, mending a broken fence, when the stepfather approached with fury burning in his eyes. His words were sharp, accusing, drenched with years of resentment. He claimed the ranch was his, that no bloodline could erase the sweat and labor he had poured into the land. But beneath his shouts was the trembling of a man who already knew he had lost. The boy stood tall, his voice calm but firm. He did not threaten, nor did he raise his hand. He spoke of truth, of legacy, of the injustice of living under lies for so long. He declared that he would not fight for his place, because his place was already his by right. The stepfather's anger clashed against this quiet certainty, and for the first time, his fury faltered. The widow rushed between them, her tears falling like rain on dry earth. She begged for peace, begged for her son's future not to be drenched in blood. Her words carried the weight of a woman who had borne too many burdens, who had seen how pride destroys men and leaves families in ruin. Yet she also knew that truth, once spoken, could not be buried again. The stepfather's hand hovered near the pistol at his hip, his pride demanding violence. But the boy's steady gaze and the presence of ranch hands who had gathered silently in the dark stopped him cold. He realized that even if he fired, he had already lost. His authority was gone, his power stripped, his pride shattered. Slowly, with bitterness seared into his soul, he turned away, leaving the ranch he once ruled. The widow's son stood in the quiet that followed, his breath heavy but his spirit unshaken. The truth of his bloodline had freed him, but it had also marked the beginning of a new chapter. No longer a boy mocked or dismissed, he had become a man shaped by fire, ready to carry the legacy denied to him for so long. And in the silence of the night, the West itself seemed to bow to the courage of one who had chosen truth over fear. The story of the widow's son and his defiance at the dinner table was not merely a quarrel between family members. It was the unearthing of a truth too powerful to be silenced. What began as a meal laced with tension became the stage for a revelation that shifted the course of lives and altered the balance of power within a valley ruled by pride. His refusal to bend beneath cruelty and his demand to know who he truly was transformed him from a boy overshadowed into a man defined by courage. The stepfather's downfall revealed a lesson carved deeply into the heart of the West. Authority built on lies and intimidation is fragile, while strength anchored in truth endures. His rage, his threats, even his hand that trembled near the pistol, could not hold power against the certainty of blood and the resilience of spirit. Pride, no matter how fierce, crumbles when faced with conviction. And that night, the man who believed himself master of the household was undone by the truth he tried so desperately to bury. The widow's tears told another story, the burden of silence, the cost of secrets, and the weight carried by those who try to protect others from the pain of truth. Her confession, though it fractured her home, freed her son. It reminded us that sometimes silence chains the innocent more than it shields them, and that love, no matter how protective, must eventually bow to honesty. In her breaking, there was also redemption, for she gave her son the gift of identity. The boy's journey became a living testament that true strength is not born from cruelty or dominance, but from standing unshaken in the face of adversity. His courage at the dinner table turned whispers into respect, shame into legacy, and fear into defiance. In the Old West, a land that tested every soul with hardship and fire, he proved that even the most fragile beginnings could give rise to a destiny stronger than steel. And so the story lingers, echoing beyond the walls of that ranch house. A reminder that truth cannot remain buried, that courage can reshape legacies, and that the fire of one heart can silence even the loudest voices of pride. If this tale struck you, let its lesson remain alive. Share your thoughts in the comments. Leave a like to carry its message further, and subscribe for more stories that reveal the hidden strength of the human spirit. For in remembering, we keep alive the echoes of the frontier, and in them, we find ourselves.